don't know how I can compete with Bethany's commentary, but I will do my very best. So I would like to first introduce myself. My name is Alex Cain. I am the owner and author of a blog and podcast called Historical Nerdery. The blog and podcast actually focuses on three things. Massachusetts preparing for revolution with an emphasis on Lexington and Concord. Secondly, loyalists and their struggle during the American Revolution. And finally, Essex County with an emphasis on Newburyport. So that is my blog. My profession, I'm involved in education currently, dealing with introducing high school students to vocational trades, working with Mass Hire. I can give you a little lecture about that if you want, and how we really need them, but I'm off the clock right now. So what I'd like to start is what we are going to discuss and talk about a little bit of an introduction. You know, when historians look at about September of 1775, all the way through to Battle of Lexington, Battle of Bunker Hill, they always focus on Middlesex County or Boston or England. However, you know, people need to understand that this area, Essex County, with an emphasis on the Merrimack Valley, and more importantly, an emphasis on Newburyport, played a very vital role to the American cause for independence. Newburyport and the surrounding communities became hotbeds of political activism, economic resistance, and civic defense. Whether it was outspoken opposition to British policies, to the mobilization of militias, this region, with again, spotlight in Newburyport, played a vital role in the movement towards self-government. So with that, what are we going to talk about? Well, nothing happened, guys, so we're all going to go home. First of all, I want to start off with what is referred to as the concept of English liberties. In order for you to understand where New Englanders, particularly Newburyport residents and Massachusetts colonists, were coming from, I want to give an introductory overview of English liberties. We will also take a look at a very brief snapshot of Newburyport political resistance on the eve of Lexington and Concord. Much of this lecture tonight is going to be referring to Newburyport and Essex counties build-up to war. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that we've discovered that takes place in the Merrimack Valley, that takes place in Newburyport. There's some documents that the Museum of Old Newbury shared with me that I've seen that I haven't seen before in other towns. So it's really neat, some of the stuff I'm going to share with you tonight. I do want to talk about Newburyport's response to the Salem affair, as well as Newburyport's response to Lexington and Concord. We will have a fashion show. I have rounded up some people. They're coming in. You will have an opportunity to see the different peoples of April 19, 1775, when the battles of Lexington and Concord took place. And then finally, time for your burning questions. Now, with your questions, if you have, I welcome all questions. The only warning I give when asking questions is my hearing stinks. Okay? I listened to heavy metal throughout the 80s. It absolutely destroyed my hearing. And my mother still yells at me about it, but it destroyed my hearing. So I may have my lovely assistant Bethany help me to translate for me if I don't hear you. If you have ever attended any of my lectures in the past, I always like to start off with inspirational quotes. And the purpose of that is to get people motivated, get people excited. You know, we're here to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in Newburyport's role. So as a result, I always start off with an inspirational quote. Hang on, everybody. I hope you had your drinks. Okay. So what I'd like to start with is the concept of English liberties. The concept of English liberties was absolutely vital to the American Revolutionary movement. You know, New Englanders, as you're going to see examples from Newburyport and other areas, are constantly invoking a defense of their English liberties and formulating Crown resistance. The origins of English liberties, allegedly, and the reason I say allegedly is some historians have recently come out and said that no, it's not the Magna Carta, which is the foundation for English liberties. It actually goes back even further, you know, into the 8th and 9th centuries of Great Britain at that time. Britain. But it allegedly, in the primary document still that the English crown and the English government relied upon was the Magna Carta, which in the 13th century was signed by King John. Now, the interesting thing is early interpretations of the Magna Carta, they correctly argued that it granted enumerated and implied rights to English royalty and English nobles only. And it was designed to rally support against overreach power by King John or other future kings. However, once you start getting between 1215 and 1800, you start seeing this gradual evolution within British constitutional principles, where they quite often will utilize this document to first oppose any efforts to tax the population, or more importantly, tax the nobles or any lords or anything along that line. The interesting thing is members of Parliament. What happened? There we go. Parliament, however, also used the Magna Carta as a springboard to start developing the concept of English liberties or English rights. And over time, between 1215 and 1800, they started to develop various concepts which became the foundation for English liberties. They included the right to due process, the right to a jury trial of peers, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, the right not to have specific property seized without just compensation, and then finally, there was also the right to protest the government and engage in civil disobedience when there was evidence that the king violated his constitutional duties. Now, okay, we're all going to get one more drink, and then we're marching somewhere. I don't know where we're going. And whoever the leader is, whatever we accomplish, I just want hair. Okay? That's all I ask for. I should have warned also, this is going to be comedy hour for the next hour and a half, because I'm trying to drag this out because my wife has chores back at home and I'm trying to do this. When you start looking at the period of colonization in North America, particularly with around New England, between 1600 and 1700, English started witnessing a growing movement that called for the codification of these English rights and an expansion of these rights into the colonies. Because in the 17th century, there was a big debate, do English rights apply to citizens who were in New England? They're not in the crown jurisdiction, the homeland. They're across the sea. Do these rights apply? Well, Massachusetts and Plymouth Bay Colony sort of took the lead on this. And in 1636, Plymouth Colony passed a code entitled the General Fundamentals, which outlined the rules, procedures, and structures of the government. But they actually contained within that document, there was the first document of its kind in the New World, a Bill of Rights. 5 years later, following Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a similar document called the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. This document was initially drafted to provide guidance to the Massachusetts General Court, the legislature. However, it codified individual liberties and protection of freemen in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So you actually see the colony is actually taking it on their part to adopt the English liberties in the New World so as to protect their white male residents and some of their residents. Now, if we jump forward to after the English Civil War, we have the Massachusetts Charter of 1691. This is considered, at the time of the American Revolution, the sacred document of Massachusetts. And what happened was, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the government of William III issued the Massachusetts Bay Charter of 1691. This document formally established the province of Massachusetts Bay. And there were several significant segments of the charter. Most notably, it merged Massachusetts Bay Colony with Plymouth Bay Colony. Secondly, it formally made Massachusetts Bay a royal colony. In doing so, it established that any royal governor would not be elected, because there were colonies that were electing some of their governors at this time. Instead, it would be appointed. The charter also broadened the governor's powers and establishment a right of self-government in Massachusetts, but on royal terms. But most importantly, and why this document is so vital to the revolutionary movement, is the charter stated that Massachusetts Bay colonists enjoyed the same rights, privileges, and liberties as any other British subject within the empire. So what this basically did is it formally recognized the concept of English liberties for the colonists. So it had become a vital, it's basically, this is New England, Massachusetts Bay Colony's Constitution on the eve of the American Revolution. I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to circle back to this concept in a little bit. So here is an example that took place in September of 1774, where you had Newburyport Committee of Safety. And I'll talk about committee safeties in a little bit, but basically this is a subcommittee of the town selectmen, and they were responsible for military preparation on the eve of war with England. The interesting thing, you can see in this clause from this quote, and it's the opening quote of this committee when they formed. It said that voted that a committee be chosen to consult and advise with each other, and if need be to communicate to the town any measures that may be conducive to the public benefit. Most especially be watchful that no encroachments are made on our constitutional rights and liberties. This is a reference again to English liberties and the concept of the Charter of 1691. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the state of the British Empire in 1763. And all I can say is, oh boy. 1763 represented the end of the French and Indian War and the origins of when the American Revolution, origins could be traced back to. Following its conquest of Canada, England began to recognize the harsh realities of its victories. In the months following the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain was not only required to administer newly found territories, but also station troops there to protect them as well. This necessitated a 10,000-man army to protect North America's frontier from any residual French operations, Native American attacks such as Pontiac's Rebellion, as well as any basically outlaws who would suddenly claim Vermont is free and independent. This is some of the factors that they were facing at this particular time. And this is where we get, by January 5th, 1763, Britain's funded debt was 122 million pounds. 1763 dollars, trust me, it's a lot of money, with an annual interest of 4 million pounds. A year later, in 1764, the debt had increased by 7 million, and by January of 1767, it had increased yet another 7 million. So England right now is really in the hole financially. And of course, when they decide, how are we going to pay for this? They start, getting together and they basically say, you know something? We need to reduce this financial burden, and we are going to start taxing and start collecting revenue from the people who benefited the most during the French and Indian War, the American colonies. And at the time, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Grenville, and of course a comment that was made once about him is that his mouth outran his mind, concluded that the American colonies were the perfect source for levying taxes because they're really not paying much. At the same time, he said, hey, you know what's also killing us? New England smugglers, such as people in Newburyport. Okay? Yeah. Who basically, they're not paying any duties. And they actually realized that in the New England ports, there was about a 6,000 pound debt per year because they weren't collecting enough revenue. And so as a result, let's tax them. Well, what happened is the original American protest started off calm, but as you keep getting closer and closer to 1775, they start to escalate. And of course what happens is if you've read history, Boston is leading the charge. They're having riots, they're threatening people, they're completely out of control. And it started off with the Stamp Act, then it went on to the Townsend Act, and then it escalated throughout the 1760s up to the Boston Massacre. Well, as I said in another talk about a year ago, then there was Newburyport. And Newburyport, I jokingly will say, looked at Boston and said, hold my beer, let me show you how it's done. Because some of the stuff that Newburyport did made Boston look like amateurs. Yes, they engaged in economic boycotts. There were definitely movements throughout the 1760s where there was this encouragement to basically non-importation, do not bring in British goods. Instead, rely upon self-sufficiency or not purchasing them. There was also organization of political protests. You saw various committees forming. You saw various letters being written to the government officials in protest. But this is where we start getting fun. Newburyport had its own version of riots. There are accounts. My favorite account is a group of a mob from Newburyport was going around trying to identify who are the loyalists in town and how can we harass them. They went to an official in town who was aligned with the custom house. There was a custom house here in 18th century Newburyport. And they went to one of the custom officials, burned an effigy outside his house. It started stopping random strangers on the street who may have been simply passing through and say, who do you support? You got 50-50 shot here. The first guy gave the wrong answer according to period accounts. It didn't end too well. There is an account afterwards that another person said to the crowd, I am what you are. Okay, good, they live on. So we do have accounts of various riots taking place in town. Property destruction took place as well. Harassment of government officials. Another great account that I've seen is there was a custom official, I believe he was referred to as a waiter, which dealt with weights and measures and other things at the custom house in 18th century Newburyport. He was really, I guess, not liked by various officials who were supporting the Patriot cause. And long story short, he was abducted one day, rowed out to an island somewhere near the mouth of the Merrimack River, and dumped there as a nor'easter was coming through. The royal governor at the time, Thomas Hutchinson, was so offended by this that he put about a 50-pound bounty out for whoever was responsible for it. That's how serious this was. And then, of course, my favorite, let's torment the loyalists. Oh my God. By the time of the American Revolution, it was not safe to be a loyalist in Newburyport. There is an account of an individual who was wrongly identified as a loyalist. They also believed that he was an informant for custom officials. They arrested him. They paraded him through Newburyport, pelting him with vegetables and pelting him with rocks. They then threw him in basically the back of a warehouse where he could not lie down fully. They beat him. There's accounts, he said, wherever I was lying down, my head got sort of tangled with sticky tar, and I had to pull my head away, and my hair was pulling out. His wife would try and plead to see him. They wouldn't let him. The next day, he was to appear in front of the Committee of Safety, at which point they realized they had the wrong guy. It was another person who was mistaken for him that was the informant and the loyalist who hightailed it out of town and fled to Portsmouth. Needless to say, this gentleman took off. So these are some of the things. Now, the fun thing which I like to talk about is, let's talk about plagiarism for a second. Jumping forward to 1770, March 5th, always remember the 5th of March of 1770, the Boston Massacre. This was an event, real quickly, that took place in Boston, where it was, again, Boston, it devolved into a fight scene, where initially some teenagers were exchanging words with a British sentry. It escalated to a crowd approaching the British sentry. Reinforcements were called in, and the British troops opened fire. Horrified Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was, at this particular point, this is probably the closest you're going to get to revolution breaking out before Lexington and Concord. It was a very, very tense situation. Well, in the months after the Boston Massacre, a series of broadsides or plates came out depicting the massacre. And this is a lesson in plagiarism. This is Henry Pelham, the original person who engraved the Boston Massacre. It's a little rough. If you look carefully, there's different positioning of windows. The 29th Regiment of Foot has, as you're going to see in a minute, different coloring from other soldiers. Certain sections are colorized, other sections are black and white. Well, somebody really, really liked this plate and said, you know something? I could make a buck off of this. This guy. Oh, it gets better, people. Paul Revere ripped off Pelham, okay? It started to, basically, it devolved into legal threats with each other, where, I'm going to sue you for ripping off my print. Paul Revere basically saying, I have no idea what you're talking about. There's very similarities. The big difference, as you can initially see, not too much wording along the front, down the bottom. Paul Revere has much more. The civilians are colorized, window placement is different, And the facings on the British troops, which you'll learn later, are different also. However, remember I said a few minutes ago, Newburyport, hold my beer? Yeah. Meet the third person. He ripped off Paul Revere. Again, you can see now, Paul Revere's like, how dare you steal my stuff? And of course, Mr. Pelham's going, really? Multiple back and forth, going back and forth, which there was threats of lawsuits amongst all of them. Really, with all consideration, the only one who was really successful was Paul Revere. This is the one that's held, 2 out of the 3 are actually held by the Massachusetts Historical Society. Now, jumping a little bit forward, I know there was something in 1773 about tea. Okay? Something happened in Lexington where they burned something. Something happened in New Boston where they might have got something wet. And Newburyport, I'm hearing there's more research that's coming out that actually seems to imply, and based upon some of the documentation that Bethany shared with me, that it was a form of a tea protest that took place here. It appears that, I can't find a burning, but I can see a seizure where they're pretty much gathering all the tea as possible and stuffing it into an armory, which was quite interesting. And apparently a brawl broke out over what was being put into the armory. But as a result of the Boston Tea Party, England went, okay, time out. This Massachusetts colony is completely out of control. We put up with the riots and all the protests and everything of the 1760s. We put up in 1770 with this riot where we got into this shooting incident. We're not going to put up with, they call it, thousands upon thousands of pounds worth of damage of tossing tea into the harbor. We are going to make an example of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and send a message to the rest of the American colonies. This behavior will not be tolerated. Massachusetts is effectively in rebellion. We are going to clamp on it, clamp it down. So what happened is what was called the Intolerable Acts. And there were a series of laws. It's not one body of law, it's a series of laws that were passed. And in response to the Tea Party, the English Parliament adopted several harsh measures and restrictive measures aimed at punishing Massachusetts. On March 31st, 1774, King George III signed the Boston Port Bill intended to reprimand Boston. Boston Port was closed to all seagoing traffic. Nothing could come in until the damages for the destroyed tea were paid in full. Now this is interesting because what you do see, and I think this is the spirit of Newburyport even today, Newburyport residents actually get together and say, how can we support Boston? Do we send them money? Do we send them food? Do we send them clothing? What can we do to support you? You also saw the Massachusetts Provincial Charter of 1691. Remember, I called that the Constitution of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It is revoked. It's thrown out the window. Which basically, the document that secured their English liberties, gone. Additional regiments of regulars, British troops, were dispatched to Boston, and the royal governor was replaced with a military authority, General Thomas Gage, who was already the supreme military commander of North America. General Gage moves the seat of government to Salem. I don't know why Salem, I'm a Newburyport fan, but they picked Salem. And the head customs office was moved to Plymouth, Massachusetts. Governor's Council was essentially replaced with a non-elective mandamus council, which pretty much did Governor Gage's bidding. And what is most troubling is in the early summer of 1774, General Gage dissolved the legislature, like the way the Massachusetts government. Kind of Star Wars-like, if you think about it. It's really kind of like this incensed Massachusetts colonists, because particularly the denial of rights. Because now at this particular point, there is a firm belief throughout Massachusetts that England is trying to provoke a war. They believe that once the war is provoked, British troops will come in and crush them, just as they did in Ireland, just as they did in India. And as a result, they then believe that we would be enslaved like the Irish and Indian counterparts. This is the mindset of the, not only just Massachusetts Bay colonies. I've seen Thomas Jefferson refer to this. I've seen George Washington refer to this. But this is the mindset. So as a result of this dissolution, Massachusetts, the various counties said, we need to call various county-level conventions where they can get together, we can decide how do we respond to this? How do we resolve these issues? And these are basically rebel conventions. They're not done with the authority of General Gage. And keep in mind also, one of the other things of the Intolerable Acts, not only did he dissolve the Massachusetts legislature, he also prohibited town meetings, okay? Now, I'm from Merrimack, a couple of towns over from you guys. Town meetings are like our lifeblood over there. Okay? They're very, very important. It's the chance for the people to provide their input. Nevertheless, Essex County, it was one of the first counties, said, we are going to form a convention. We are going to stand up, we're going to determine what we're going to do. And as a result, Essex County, every town in Essex County, including Newburyport, sent delegates to a convention in Ipswich to discuss the growing crisis. They arrived on September 6th to discuss what to do. And they passed a whole array of resolutions that would result in, how do we respond to the English government and their tyranny? And so the first thing was, they said, we demand the resignation of the British officials, including Gage. He needs to step down. These British royal lackeys who are going around crushing our rights, you need to step down. Number two, they said, we want to form a Massachusetts Grand Army. An army that would be composed of militia that would defend our English liberties. And finally, they said, we need to form basically a rogue government, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And in October, the very first week of October 1775, Massachusetts Provincial Congress was formed in Salem, Massachusetts. So that is the state on the eve of the American Revolution. Now, we angry now? We angry at the British? Okay, good. All right, so now we're going to talk about what happened in response to all this, and what I refer to as the rise of the Minutemen. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is Minutemen in itself. A lot of people think, oh, the Minutemen, they just sprung up from out of the blue. Minutemen never existed before 1775. The concept of Minutemen actually dates back to about 1640, where you would take certain segments of your militia company, and I'm going to talk about militias in just a second, and they would be your rapid response unit. They existed during King Philip's War, they existed during Queen Anne's War, they existed even during the French and Indian War. Every town in Massachusetts in 1775 had at least one militia company. If you were between the ages of 16 and 60 and a male, you were required to serve in the militia. And we're going to talk about what they were required to carry and where in just a second. But if you did not serve, either you would be fined or prosecuted criminally, or you had an exception. Massachusetts is interesting on the books. They have various legal provisions prohibiting enslaved people from serving in the militia. However, many Massachusetts towns turned a blind eye and actually had enslaved people serving in their militia, either to augment their ranks or to serve as a substitute for a white man who did not want to serve in the militia. So what happened was, in October of 1774, Massachusetts Provincial Congress got together and said, hey, Essex County Convention and a few other counties said we need to raise a Massachusetts Grand Army. How the heck are we going to do that? The first thing they said was, all right, we need to remove all the Loyalist officers from command and replace them with our own. And that's what they did. They either voluntarily or through threats of violence removed Loyalist officers. A case in point is Richard Saltonstall out of Haverhill. He was the regimental commander of the 4th Essex Regiment, which is the Merrimack Valley Regiment from Salisbury down to Andover. He was a Loyalist officer. They approached him nicely and said, hey, we think you need to step down. This is not the right place for you. He refused, at which point militia companies from Haverhill, Bradford, and Salem, New Hampshire appeared on his front lawn. At which point he said, I think I need to resign and I'm going to be relocating to Boston. So this is some of the things that we are seeing. But what happened was the Massachusetts Provincial Congress said, we need to remove the officers. Then what we're going to do is we're going to tell all the militia companies, look at your men. We want you to take from each militia company at least a quarter of them and assign them to a separate company called Minutemen. Okay? Now, average age of a Minuteman. All right, show of hands. 40 years or plus? A couple of people. 30 or older? 16 to 22. When you look at combat during World War II, Vietnam, even today, what's the average age of the soldiers? They're boys. okay, or young girls, okay? They're maybe 19, 20, 21. That is your Minutemen. In 1775, and I use the analogy, my son is 24 years old. If he and I had to run to the town common, he's going to get there at least an hour before me. At least. I'm going to stop at Dunks, talk to my fellow militiamen, although the Minutemen have it. You want for your minute companies your rapid response unit. You want the best shape, the youngest, the most agile to serve in that unit. So what you start seeing after the Massachusetts Provincial Congress issued its orders, you start seeing various resolutions also being issued to start preparing for war. Now, this is a recommendation of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. It came out in December of 1774. The resolution instructs all the towns, hey, all your Minutemen, all your militiamen, these are the equipment they have to carry when they mobilize for war. Make sure your men have these items. Okay, do not screw around. You need to make sure they have them if we're going to war with England. So some of the items, this particular says, the improvement of the militia in general and the art military. Let's talk, we'll get to that. Has been therefore throughout necessary and strongly recommended. We now think that particular care should be taken in the towns and the districts of this colony, that each of the Minutemen, and again, there's other resolutions are referencing militia, not already provided therein, should be immediately equipped with the following: a firearm, a musket. Rifles didn't exist in 18th century Newburyport or Massachusetts, so this is a smoothbore weapon. On top of that, they need a bayonet, a cartridge box, 30 rounds of cartridge and balls. There are additional recommendations that they had to have a knapsack and a blanket as well. These militiamen are ready for war, and this is what they're trying to acquire. Now, here are some examples. When that resolution came out from the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, various towns in Essex County responded right away and said, we need to start providing this equipment for our Minutemen and for our militia. And of course, anytime a government wants to do something, what's one of the first objections? How much is it going to cost? And so you're going to see in a few seconds, some towns were like, we can't afford it. In Amesbury, I've been warned about the rivalry between Newburyport and Amesbury. I promise you, before this talk is over, you're going to hate Amesbury even more. But you will be vindicated, okay? Amesbury, first of all, Amesbury, if you ever want to give someone a hard time from Amesbury, initially they voted not to form a Minuteman company. Oh my God, a bunch of loyalists. It actually came down to cost. But however, when you have a town meeting and you do not like the results of your first town meeting, what do? You have a second town meeting and pack it with all your friends. And that's what they did. They had a second town meeting and the Minuteman company was formed. However, they resolved, listen, Minutemen, you got to provide your own stuff. We are not going to buy you anything. Boxford was the same way. They both came down, hey, it's coming down to cost. We can't afford it. You've got to provide your own equipment. So you would see probably a more poorly equipped Minuteman from Amesbury or Boxford. By comparison, however, Danvers resolved that its Minuteman company would be fully armed and equipped, all expenses paid by the town. Firearm, bayonet, pouch, knapsack, ammunition, cartridges and balls, all provided by the town. And in Andover, very similar. Andover decided to focus on bayonets. They wanted to make sure that all their Minutemen had edged weapons with their muskets. And we're going to talk about that in just a second because there's some really neat things about it. So often I get this question, hey, Alex, where did these weapons and equipment come from? And originally the thought was, well, I'm sure they were buying them off British soldiers. Perhaps it's leftovers from the French and Indian War. Not even close. What happened in every town in Massachusetts, and I have over 156 documented accounts throughout Massachusetts, is each of the towns were going, say, for example, to a saddler or a leather worker. Hey, you specialize in leather working. Could you make the Minutemen their cartridge boxes? They would go to a tailor in town and say, hey, you're a tailor. Will you make the knapsacks for our men? Another person would go say, hey, listen, we know you do some woodworking. Would you be willing to take the fowling gun, which is a hunting gun that many militiamen carried, cut back the wood a bit so the barrel is exposed and we can slip a bayonet over it? Or they would say, hey, we know you do some wheelwright work. Can you help put together an artillery carriage? What was happening throughout Massachusetts was a cottage industry of wartime preparation emerged. where you would see multiple talented individuals in their trades shifting from civilian work over towards military operation. And there is hints that I've seen this in Newburyport as well. I've also seen, which is really, really cool, William Coombs, who basically said, listen, I'm going to get one of my ships, I'm sending it to the French colonies and down in the Caribbean, and I'm going to buy as many French muskets as possible. Brought him back up here, and I've seen some hints that he may have been doing that as early as March of 1775. Now the next question I get is, hey, all right, so all these guys are really armed and equipped? Yeah, but didn't when April 19th happened and Lexington and Concord happened, didn't they just get up and run? You know, they were never prepared, they hid behind a tree, they never drilled or prepared for war? Again, no, the answer actually is they were drilling heavily. Andover ordered its militiamen on the first day of December to meet together and choose somebody to instruct them in the art military, to instruct them in military discipline, and that they be well equipped and have other necessary warlike armor for their performing of all military maneuvers. What that means is that they need to hire somebody, and we're going to find out who this person is in just a second. They needed to hire somebody to train them for war, but at the same time they wanted to have them trained with all their equipment on. So that's what we were seeing here. Amesbury, basically, they were cheap with the equipment and the Minutemen. They said they wanted them drilling frequently. They wanted them exercising 4 hours in a fortnight. They modified it for 4 hours a week. On March 14th, 1775, Haverhill voted to raise $30 to procure a military instructor to instruct the militia in the art military. 1 week later, the town voted that its Minutemen, and eventually I saw other documentation from Haverhill, its militia companies and other groups, hired all the same man, a Mr. George Marsden. Now, when I originally came across George Marsden's name about a decade and a half ago, I said, oh, he's going to be a French and Indian War veteran. They hired him so that he could train the Minutemen based upon his experience fighting out in the woods. And that was until I was discussing with a historian who specializes in British regiments named Don Haggis. And Don Haggis said, Alex, you are way off on that one. George Marsden was a deserter from the British Army. He fled Boston and came up to Haverhill. He trained, basically Haverhill was a very friendly town for British deserters. I've seen various newspaper accounts of them hiding British soldiers, and then they would basically siphon them up into New Hampshire and Maine. This particular George Marsden was from the 59th Regiment of Foot. When he fled, his wife followed with him shortly afterwards. He went to the various Minuteman companies and militia companies in the Merrimack Valley and said, I'm willing to train you the services. He started with Haverhill, started training at Bradford, started training Methuen, started training the Andovers, and then continued training Amesbury. Every Minuteman regiment from Amesbury, every Minuteman company from Amesbury down to Andover was trained by a British deserter. I do not have any accounts of him training Newburyport troops, but you're going to see some really neat stuff in a few seconds about Newburyport. The real neat thing is most of the Merrimack Valley from Amesbury down to Andover during the Battle of Bunker Hill were inside the redoubt during the fight. And the accounts are they fought like wolves. And I do attribute George Marsden's training to their performance during that day. Okay, as promised, Newburyport. Newburyport was, there's some really, really cool stuff here, okay, that I'm going to share with you. First of all, when it came to arms and equipment with Newburyport, on October 6, 1774, this is just as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress is meeting for the first time. They haven't even started talking about preparing for war. Newburyport is already ahead of the game. Newburyport on October 4, 1774, passed orders that it be recommended to the town that they pass a vote that every person equipped with arms and ammunition according to law voted that they do and inspect the state of their weapons. Newburyport said, listen, every member of the militias or private companies, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, in this town, we're going to inspect their muskets, we're going to inspect their cartridge boxes, we're going to inspect whatever they have to determine the state of Newburyport of preparation for war with England. This is before the Massachusetts Provincial Congress is really even off the ground. There's only 2 other towns that I've seen that are ahead of the curve, like Newburyport is. Methuen is one of them. Lexington is the other one. That's it. October 24th, in the aftermath of the Minuteman resolution from Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the town of Newburyport voted that the inhabitants of the town make sure that they have bayonets fixed to their guns as quickly as possible. Okay? So that means they're going to be going to various woodworkers within Newburyport, and they're going to be asking them, all right, filing gun, you can't slip a bayonet off of it unless you remove some of the wood at the end of the barrel. They're going to start doing that for guns that need bayonets. So they're going to be making modifications to weapons. Now here's a really neat thing. Newburyport only took about a month and they came back with their report. And you know, unlike, again, I told you, I'm picking on Amesbury. Amesbury did something similar where they did an inspection in early January of 1775. And they said, hey, has anybody checked our town stock, which is basically an armory for any of the poor people in town who could not afford a musket or ammunition or cartridge boxes? They cracked it open, because it hadn't been cracked open for a while, and they looked around and they went, where is everything? Various people had broken in and stolen stuff from it over the years. By comparison, Newburyport says, hey, we're doing really well here. It was determined that in general, the males of the town are tolerably well equipped with firearms and ammunition, much better than they expected. Way to go, Newburyport. Now this is really cool. So this is the resolution to form, or a recommendation, excuse me, to form Minuteman companies in Newburyport from the Newburyport Committee of Safety. So keep in mind, who is overseeing to ensure that Minutemen and militia of every town are armed and equipped and supplied? It's going to be generally your selectmen. If it's not your selectmen, then it's going to be a committee of safety. And that's what Newburyport created. They created a committee of safety that was designed to ensure their men were properly equipped for war. This is a recommendation that was made on November 7th, 1774, that Newburyport enlist 50 men into a company, Minutemen. So, what's Newburyport look like on the eve of Lexington and Concord with all this military preparation? First of all, your town had between 8 and 9 military companies in this community. They were frequently drilling and acquiring arms and equipment for their men. Here's the other cool thing. At least one of the units had a full military uniform. This is the breakdown of it. You had 4 militia companies. These are the militia companies that everyone between 16 and 60 was required to serve in, unless you're drawn from one of these other ones. You had 2 Minuteman companies. So you took 100 men from those 4 militia companies and formed Minuteman companies. But here's a really cool thing. You also had what were referred to as independent companies. You see this more often during the American Civil War, where you have basically paramilitary organizations that are funded by various residents, where they get together, form their own military units, and they're sanctioned by the town, and if they're called out for war, they would go out with the militia and Minutemen. Newburyport had an artillery company. It was referred to as the Independent Artillery Company. They were also uniformed. They also had an independent military society, and this is where I'm getting a little confused and I need to do research. I'm not sure if the Independent Military Society is the same thing as the Independent Marine Society. It could be. I got to do some more research on it, so that's why I'm saying 8 to 9 for purposes. This is pretty big. I've seen other towns. Haverhill had something comparison. Haverhill had about 7. Andover had 6. Lexington had 1. You have 8 to 9 military organizations. So with that, from the October 26, 1774, Essex Gazette, here is a newspaper account that the Independent Military Society of this town met and performed the military exercise, and then they went to a bar. There's going to be a theme for the next 10 minutes on this, so hold on to your drinks. The same report, this newspaper had multiple accounts on October 26 of Newburyport militias mobilizing. The same day before training bands, that's your town militia. The formal legal name for militia in 18th century New England was training band. So here you have your 4 militia companies also drilling on the same day. You have Newburyport artillery. The really neat thing about it, here we go. If you take a look at the 3rd line down, you'll see they were equipped in arms and uniformity of dress. Uniformity of dress means they were wearing uniforms. I do not know what the uniforms look like. We're going to see a couple of examples during the fashion show. They could have mimicked British officers. They could have mimicked French and Indian War uniforms. They could have been something completely different. But this is an example of an independent paramilitary organization in Newburyport during this time. And again, if you go through Newburyport archives, historical newspapers, you'll find really neat stuff with that. So as we start going quickly, I just want to share a couple of stories with you. The Salem affair, which we just celebrated the 250th anniversary a couple of days ago. Newburyport and Merrimack Valley militia units received an alarm roughly about midday, mid-afternoon, that British troops had landed in Marblehead and were advancing on Salem. The 9 military companies, or 8 military companies, as well as Amesbury and Haverhill and the other units, basically swept up and came down by way of Newbury, along what is traditionally Route 1A, working their way towards Ipswich. When they arrived in Ipswich, an alarm rider came along and said, listen, the event's over, you can go home. The cannons that the British were looking for are long gone, go home. The original newspaper accounts that I read basically detailed that after that transpired, the Newburyport militia basically turned around and started marching home and halted in the first tavern that they found. At which point, according to the newspaper accounts, they drank the tavern dry. They had over 100 toasts, which is a heck of a challenge. And then went on their merry way, and the account was they stiffed the tavern owner. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to be vindicated. Okay? Because literally today, I was talking with a historian from the Salem Maritime National Park, and she was telling me, she said, I've got the second half of the story. And she said it was a flim-flam. Newburyport was framed. She said the first newspaper account is wrong. It wasn't Newburyport that trashed the tavern. It was Amesbury. So again, follow me. We're going across the chain bridge, and we're going to reclaim what's ours. The account is really vivid. I am going to share it with Bethany so that she can share it with all of you. The account is actually funny. It talks about the poor tavern owner. The unit goes in, they drank everything. Then they proceeded to trash the tavern. And according to this newspaper account from Marblehead, they were so intoxicated, the Amesbury militia was vomiting the entire way home. So, Amesbury, am I right? And I'm from Merrimack, we don't like that. Now we will stick with the theme of alcohol just briefly. The battles of Lexington and Concord, Newburyport did not participate in the battles of Lexington and Concord. Unfortunately, when the alarm riders came, Newburyport was a little bit hesitant, probably because of the Salem affair. They were like, well, we've marched all the way down to Ipswich, had to turn around. Amesbury screwed us, and we kept coming. When an alarm rider arrived in town about between 11 and 1 on April 19, 1775, the residents of Newburyport were kind of reluctant to believe this was accurate. They felt maybe it was the British were marching out, and they were going to come back into Boston with nothing happening. So they sent an alarm rider to Danvers to confirm what was going on. The alarm rider returned in the late afternoon and said, yes, the news is correct. Newburyport, you've got to mobilize your troops because there was a fighting in Lexington, there was fighting in Concord, this war has begun. And so I found this really, really neat document before we began our fashion show. This also was shared with me by Museum of Old Newbury. When militia units and Minuteman units went to war, they actually charged for their mileage and expenses. I don't have a sarcastic comment, I just think that's awesome. And so Newburyport did the same. Well, here's a document that explains what they brought for their road trip, okay, for food. And it's really neat because you get to see what they were eating during this time, and it gets into what their rations were. And so it included white bread, chocolate, sugar, fish, cheese, all good stuff. And then I kept looking, and where is it? Oh, they brought ship's bread as well, which would have been hardtack. It's here somewhere in the list. 65 gallons of rum. Newburyport. Rum was a common drink during the time, but myself and the reenactors you're about to meet in a second, we were really scratching our heads going, okay, was it a hogshead? Was it in their canteens? Either way, first of all, they must have been feeling really good by the time they hit Cambridge. But secondly, it was a lot. But this is a great document. Museum of Old Newbury put it up on Facebook last year in celebration of the 249th. But this does show what they were eating. So with that, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a fashion show. So we're going to pause a little bit and want to talk about, now this is an original 18th century drawing of a British light infantry soldier. You are going to see in a few seconds light infantry soldiers. But I managed to get some reenactors. They represent various organizations. I have the Acton Minutemen, which I know is a staple organization, a strong partner with Newburyport, particularly for various events around town. I was able to round up a representative of the Lexington Minutemen, who does the Battle of Lexington reenactment every year. I was able to recruit a civilian as well, a female interpreter, so you can see what a female middling class in Newburyport may have looked like. And then finally, I got a couple of other guys. Yeah, they're still there. I thought they would have deserted by now. So, with that, let me first invite up I'm going to have the Acton Minutemen and my Lexington militiamen come up to the stage so I can explain what you are seeing. So the really neat thing, what you see up here, these two organizations, I always say, if you're looking to get into this hobby, I'm also in this hobby. My wife calls me a nerd, rightfully so. These four individuals, as well as the other two reenactors out back, they give like 150% effort to what they do. What you see up on the stage is probably the closest you're going to see to April 19, 1775. So the first person I'm going to ask to step forward is Tyler. Tyler is roughly about 30 years of age. He would be on your upper end of a Minuteman. Okay, he could probably be serving as a sergeant, could possibly be serving as a lieutenant. As you can see, he is dressed in civilian clothing. He is wearing what is referred to as a frock coat, which is the fashion of 1770s men. He is also wearing a skirted waistcoat, breeches, which were the more common fashion of the time. He has stockings, which if you turn to the side, Tyler, you can see are held up by garters. Finally, you look at him and say, wow, he's wearing boots too. Aren't those boots kind of sexy? Actually, they're what are referred to as farmer's boots. They're cloth gaiters. They would be designed to keep mud and stones and brambles and everything out of his shoes. He would have buckled shoes as well. From his side closest to the audience, if you just raise up your arm just for a second, Tyler, you can see he's equipped with a bayonet, which means that that bladed weapon would be affixed to his musket. He is also carrying what is referred to as a cheese box canteen, which is the most common canteen that you would have seen in 1775 Massachusetts, most likely filled with rum. If you switch around to the other side, Tyler is carrying, I'm going to step away and yell, this is what is referred to as a cartridge box. This is what he would carry his ammunition in. He would have had 19 rounds of pre-prepared ammunition, measured powder, lead ball, and paper, all to be rammed down into the barrel. He is also wearing a powder horn. Interesting enough, which I do know Bethany put up a powder horn earlier. This is a reproduced powder horn that Tyler made. He actually did scrimshaw as well, which is very common for 18th century, 1775 militiamen to do artwork on their horns. If he faces, so the knapsack and pack are facing the audience, this is his campaign gear. So you can see he's carrying a blanket, knapsack, as well as a camp hatchet as well. And finally, if you do a 180 for me and hold up your musket, Tyler is carrying a military musket, but not something that the British would have given him. This is a pattern 1728 French musket. The best way I can give it a comparison was French guns were highly, highly sought after by New Englanders. Very reliable, very easy to break down, very easy to maintain. If a militiaman did not have a filing piece, often they would have these particular guns as well. Thank you, Tyler. Now, if we had Paul step forward. Paul is a militiaman, slightly older, just as good looking. Again, he is equipped for campaign. He is wearing, again, a frock coat, slightly different style. If he holds up his arms, you can see the cuff. So just hold your arm like that, bring it in. You can see cuffs along the side there. That's another 1775 fashion style. He's wearing a slightly shorter white waistcoat, wool breeches. He does have buckles instead of garters down on the side, which will hold up his stockings. He does not have farmer's boots. He's out with his buckled shoes. Like Tyler on his side, if you can see, you have a bayonet. He does. He has a bayonet, and he has what is called a staved canteen. The musket he is carrying is a Brown Bess, which would have been a British infantry musket that may have been acquired either through theft or recent acquisition from a deserter. On top of that, he has a cartridge box like Tyler, carrying the same amount of rounds. And if you can just turn to the side so I can talk about the stave canteen for just a second. The stave canteen was a second style where Tyler's looks more like a hat box, is the best way I could describe it. Paul's basically is a style that you would have seen coming probably about 1760s, early 1770s. Face to the rear, facing towards the screen. As with Tyler, he is the second wave of attack. So when the Minutemen are gone, they're responding to the Lexington alarm. He and his fellow men, who are roughly about 35 to about 50, are all mobilizing, getting together. Most of the militia, usually, if they were alarmed, they probably mobilized within 1 to 3 hours after the Minutemen left. Again, he's equipped for war. He has a blanket. He has a pack. Would have food inside. Thank you very much, Paul. And then lastly, we have for militiamen, we have this guy, Steve Crosby. You may notice, well, first of all, I have to be polite here. Steve is what is referred to as the alarm list, okay? The alarm list is the reserve of the militia forces in Massachusetts. Every town, if you were between the ages of 50 to 60, 65, you would be transferred from your militia company to the alarm list, where you would be held in reserve only for dire emergencies. So on 8, we believe in you, Steve, you can do it. So when these two gentlemen took off for Newburyport, our man Steve here is guarding the town. Okay, and that's what the alarm list did when many of the minute and militia companies mobilized. Let's hear it for Steve. There's a couple of things that maybe might stick out besides his extraordinary good looks, and he made me say that. Again, he is dressed very similar to the other men. They are all wearing 1770s fashion. However, because he has not been mobilized outside of his town, Steve, if you could just turn around. What's he missing? Pack and blanket. He's guarding the town, and I see multiple accounts from Essex County as well as Middlesex County when the alarm list was mobilized after the minute and militia companies left. These are the gentlemen who are guarding town officials. They're guarding the town ammunition depots. They're guarding the meeting houses as well. So they actually did play a vital role. He also is equipped with a cartridge box. It's slightly older in age, similar pattern, but a slightly longer flap, which would suggest maybe a 1750s style. He is also equipped with a bayonet, hopefully. Yes, he has a different style bayonet and an older canteen as well. The interesting thing about the alarm list is, real quickly, have you guys heard of what is referred to as the Ipswich Fright? Oh, you're going to love it. It's coming up this year. We're going to celebrate it. Ipswich Fright is 3 days after the battles of Lexington and Concord. There was a rumor that spread through Essex County that the British had landed in Ipswich and were marching inland to exact revenge for Lexington and Concord. And basically you had from Newburyport all the way down to Andover, and Newburyport all the way down to Beverly emptied out. The civilians fled. And they basically fled up into New Hampshire. There's some wonderful accounts that you do have, including Newburyport. Well, who's guarding the town during this time? The alarm list. Who's going to help the people get to safety? The alarm list. So when the people fled, then he would have thrown on the pack, and then he would have thrown on the blanket and guided the kids, guided the women, guided the elderly to safety. I'm saving the best for last, which would be Laurie. Step forward. Laurie is dressed as what you would see is basically a middling or middle-class person in Newburyport or Middlesex County. She, first of all, I'm going to work my way up. She has buckled shoes and stockings, which I suppose would be held up by garters as well. I'm going to take your word for it. She would have been wearing 2 petticoats. Usually one would be closest to the body would have been linen or a wool or a silk, which I did notice a silk. Usually she would wear in 2 layers. But underneath that, which I forgot, she was wearing a shift, which is basically a long shirt that starts at the shoulders and goes down to just about below the knees. And then on top of that, she is wearing what are referred to as stays. Basically, I hate to say it, but I guess the only thing I call it stays. First of all, they're lined with whalebone. Okay, they're not corsets, but basically, I almost call them the equivalent of 18th century bras. Is that an appropriate way to describe it?
They're longer.
Yeah, they're longer. Usually you'd see them from about maybe about the pelvis area up to about the chest area. She does have the top of her outfit as well, which is pinned together. She is also wearing a neckerchief to cover herself, as well as a cap and bonnet.
Women always have their head covered, so this was worn all day, and then when they went out, they would wear whatever type of bonnet on top. They always had their hair covered.
And finally, she's wearing period-correct 18th century glasses. Well, I would encourage you after the show to corner her so she can talk to you a little bit more. I watched a couple of videos to get ready for this, and hopefully I passed. C? Okay, I got a C. All right, thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to kick you off the stage. Before I bring out my last 2 guests and start answering questions, I want to talk about potential uniforms that the independent companies would have worn. This is an example, Bob Belchis. He's a member of the 2nd New Hampshire Light Infantry Company. He is portraying a New Hampshire militia officer in 1774. So it is possible Newburyport's uniform could have looked like that. Don't know. Haverhill actually put in a description they wanted to create a uniform for its own military company, but the Battle of Lexington and Concord started, so they were never able to purchase it. But it's kind of neat because they describe it as basically a blue and buff coat, with a blue coat with yellow buff facings, buff breeches. They will also have a military cocked hat. They were going to try and acquire brown vest muskets, etc. So as a result, this is, again, potentially what the uniform may have looked like. I'm really sorry. I'm just going to ask with these guys, you give them a 10-minute head start to the car. Come on up. So first, I'd like to introduce members of the 52nd Regiment of Foot and the 10th Regiment of Foot. Rory on the left is actually a Newburyport resident. If you want to have words about his uniform, for the right price, I'll give you his address. These are what are referred to as light infantry troops. Now, Ellen on the right is dressed in winter gear, slightly different. As you can see, she has full-length leggings. Those were designed for winter. So this is what you would have seen a light infantry soldier perhaps doing guard duty in Boston before they marched out to Lexington and Concord, or they might have worn this when they were going to Salem, because Salem was in February of 1775. On top of that, she's wearing wool breeches. She has, in front of her, on her waist, she has what is referred to as a belly box. That is a cartridge box that the British light infantry troops would have carried their ammunition in. However, on top of that, you may see a brown pouch that's next to the belly box. That is to carry additional musket balls and wadding. And on top of that, she would have also carried a powder horn. Light infantry were actually trained to act and think independently. Light infantry were generally your fastest, most capable, most intelligent troops, according to legend. The one thing about the British Army you should understand, many people think, oh, they're all criminals, they're all rogues. No, there was actually a system in place where British soldiers were provided with an education, they were provided with support, they were provided with family security. So for many, this was more of an economic choice than being forced into a difficult situation. Napoleonic Wars are completely different. Moving further up, you may notice also when you're looking at these two soldiers, their facings, which would be basically the yellow and the buff. They're different. There is a reason for that, that is because they represent two different regiments. The regimental commanders were the ones responsible for clothing their troops as well as acquiring the regimental coloring as well as the lace. So if you see, for example, with Evelyn, you take a look, she's got the yellow. She also has various white dashes that are going across. That is the lace of the regiment. Her buttons will also say, I believe, either X or 10. X? 10. Designating the 10th Regiment of Foot. These two individuals represent two light infantry regiments that actually fought in Lexington and Concord. So what you are seeing is spot-on representation of British soldiers during this time. On top of that, I believe she is wearing a tin canteen, which would have been a way to carry water, as well as bayonets as well. Now, what's the other thing you notice about their caps? They're different. Again, down to regimental preference. So with the 10th Regimental Soldier, she is wearing a leather cap that actually has chains in circular fashion going around the top. That is to deflect saber blows from cavalry. She also has a feather going up the top as well. Very nice feather. Rory, on the other hand, has a cloth cap. His cloth cap is marked with GR, as well as 52 for the 52nd Regiment. That is what it would have happened, is that would have been a cocked hat that would have been cut down for a cap. British light infantry always wore, generally I shouldn't say, in the early years of the war, wore caps similar to this. They didn't want to get tangled up in the woods. They didn't want things in their way as they're loading and firing. These soldiers were trained to fire on their own. They were trained to aim. They were trained to fire from standing, kneeling, laying down, behind a wall, behind a tree, you name it. I have seen during reenactments, I have to laugh because most of the British light infantry reenactors these days, I'm convinced, belong to some college track team because I've literally seen them hurdle stone walls. For Rory, notice you see his facings are buff, which again is a representation of his regiment. Also, he has a belly box. He has shorter gaiters, military gaiters, same purpose as a farmer's boot that I described earlier. He is holding up his breeches with leather garters, not cloth like you saw with Tyler the Minuteman. He also has a shot bag as well as a powder horn. I see. Yep. Oh, we have a haversack, which is carries food in as well. You have his bayonet. You can also see he has a second black square box on top of his back. That's extra ammunition to carry. So he's really loaded for bear on this. So these were then the two British light infantry. Thank you very much. This is your British Grenadier. So the light infantry made up about half of the British expedition to Concord. The other half were grenadiers. This is a grenadier from the 10th Regiment of Foot. So this would have been the counterpart to the British light infantry soldier that you saw. Grenadiers were traditionally taller, heavier, and were considered shock troops. They were the ones that you would send to storm a fort. They were the ones that you would send to break a line first. I'll take that back. Some of the grenadiers who went out in Lexington and Concord on April 19th wore the bearskin caps. The bearskin caps generally gave them an extra foot of height. However, some grenadier regiments that I've seen actually wore cocked caps. He also has a sword. He would have had a cartridge box around his waist, and he's carrying a brown bess musket. The final two is, let's talk about Royal Artillery and musicians. There were Royal Artillery that went out to Lexington and Concord. They went there because if they want to recover any cannons, they wanted to disable the guns and spike them and render them inoperable. So as a result, they were there to assist with the destruction of weapons. Then you have musicians. Talk about a fancy uniform. British Army musicians wore what was called reverse colors. So this is a drummer from the 5th Regiment of Foot, which means that the regular light infantry soldier would have had a red coat with green facings. Okay, so this particular drummer, and they played a very important role. They weren't just there to play music or just to entertain troops. Because of the sound of battle, they were often used to send out signals to everyone. So with that, I'm going to ask Ms. Bethany to come out. Your burning questions. Listen, we can stay here all night. My wife has chores. She's 5 feet and can take me. I really want to avoid her. So with that, I'm trying to put my hearing aids, but questions I can answer. Yes, sir.
How many pounds were the soldiers both on the British and American side carrying?
Usually, that's a great question. Usually, let's take a British soldier for starters.
Repeat the
British
question.
soldiers and stuff.
How many
All of them.
pounds were the British and the colonists carrying?
Starting with the muskets usually range between 9 and 12 pounds in weight. Usually once you had cartridge boxes which were filled with ammunition, that, keep in mind they had lead balls in them as well, so you're probably adding about another 10 to 15 pounds to it. In total, between the packs, the blanket, the water, the ammunition, the guns, the gear, usually somewhere between 30 to 50 pounds in weight. And that's, yeah, it's light. And honestly, yeah. And so what happened is a lot of times in a traditional battle, often the Continental forces or British soldiers would ditch the packs and ditch the gear. I've seen records of General Glover, the famed Glover's Brigade from the Battle of Trenton. He told his men, ditch everything but a blanket and a cartridge box and a bayonet. That's it. Go in. And as the war progressed, they started to reduce their load. But a full soldier with all the gear, and of course, I'm not even including the clothing. It's heavy wool. Okay? They were all wearing wool at this particular time. Wool was the fashion of 18th century. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Where were the British when the militiamen were all practicing, training, and what were the British doing?
Really, really angry. Hanging on by. So there's two responses to that. One thing that often happened is the British, when they were drilling, sometimes they would go out into the countryside just to exercise and get out and become familiar with the countryside, and also to practice some of their maneuvers. Every time they did it, up on a hill, a militia company would appear. It was more of an army of observation. They would turn around and go back. Usually what would happen is General Gage would not send out somebody in uniform saying, go watch Bethany's militia company and see what they're up to. Because as soon as they do that, they're going to get chased back to Boston, or the militia is going to disperse. So General Gage had a whole network of informants, including people in Newburyport, who were writing back to him saying, this is what's going on in Andover, this is what's going on in Newburyport, this is what we're seeing in Concord. And he's getting intelligence reports, and he's sending it back to Boston. And that's why he basically said, around the beginning of January 1775, we've got to do something, because this is getting out of control. In one of the letters he wrote, they're all highly armed, they're making bayonets, they are all in backpacks and canteens, they are preparing for a major war. Do something, give me more troops. And that's what led to Lexington and Concord. So it's more of an intelligence operation than actually go out and watch them go out. So we had a question over here. No? Okay.
What's the population of Newburyport in comparison to Andover?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, how did the population of Newburyport at that time
Yep.
compare to the population of Andover, Amesbury?
Excellent question.
Hold on, I got to. Oh, there it is. Right. Okay, so I got to do my job. The question is, how did the population of Newburyport compare to other local communities like Andover?
Yeah, to the surrounding town.
Yeah, to the surrounding town.
Population of Newburyport was roughly about 4,000 to 6,000, roughly, around the beginning of the American Revolution. The towns in the Merrimack Valley, you would think they were considerably smaller, and generally they were. Now, I'm going to use Bradford and Haverhill as an example. Today, if you go in there, they're one city. Okay? Back then, Bradford was separate, and Groveland was considered part of, parts of Groveland were considered part of Bradford or Oxford. Generally, what I've seen in the towns, I've seen roughly between 1,500 to about 3,000, depending upon the community. Andover was one of the much larger ones. They had 4 militia companies and 2 Minuteman companies. Haverhill was another one that was sort of up there. Newburyport was on the larger side for an Essex County population. Other questions? Yes?
Why do you suppose Newburyport is not credited in history books? Is it because the popularity of
It's
Hold on, I have to repeat the question.
He's
He's so excited. We love it. The question is why Newburyport has not been given its credit in the history books. I read it because Alex and I were not on the case until recently.
My editorial comment is it's a crime. Okay? There were stories that were written, but of course, where were the battles fought? Lexington and Concord. So in the aftermath of the American Civil War, when there was this movement to try and unify the country and the centennial had started, everyone's converging to those areas to celebrate. The problem is here, Newburyport did so much during the Revolutionary War effort. They provided arms and ammunition. They were a supply depot for the Continental Army. I call them the Wolf Pack. They had one of the toughest privateer fleets in the area. They should have gotten a better story, and I think it's incumbent upon historians to start taking a second look. And said, one thing I looked at before preparation in case it came up, I mean, Newburyport lost 2 soldiers in the Battle of Bunker Hill. They had regiment at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but everyone just wants to look at Charlestown. People here in Newburyport could hear the battle as it was taking place because of deforestation. It's a shame that it's taken, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to promote Newburyport, promote Essex County, and promote the Merrimack Valley, because when it came to Bunker Hill, this county and this area is the ones that's responsible. From Billerica all the way up to Newburyport, most of the troops who had casualties at Bunker Hill came from that region. So it's incumbent upon us to start sharing that story. So, yes, sir.
Did Newburyport militia ever engage with the British, and if so, when?
Okay, so the question is, did the Newburyport militia ever engage with the British, and if so, when? Bunker Hill.
Not at Lexington and Concord, at Bunker Hill. So with Little's regiment, which was one of the Newburyport regiments that came in, Garish's was the other, and I should say the Newburyport area. They basically provided relief as during the third attack, as the American line was starting to collapse. Little's came in to shore it up, and they actually engaged, trying to provide covering fire as the Americans withdrew from the field. So absolutely positively, yes, that was probably the first time that Newburyport engaged during the fight. The other one, I take that back, I lied. There was also what is referred to as a Battle of Chelsea Creek, which took place in May of 1775. A little skirmish in what is now Revere, East Boston, that's completely paved over. It was basically part of a foraging war. There were Newburyport troops that were there to support as well. So those are your first 2. I'll start here, then I'll head over there next.
At what point did someone take charge of all these individual militia to organize them into one army?
So the question is, at what point did someone, who took control of all these companies and organized them into an army? Did I get that right?
So going back, keep in mind, first of all, militia companies, I'm going to start with militia companies, were organized by town. Every town by law was supposed to have a militia company. Ugh. From there, they were organized on the regimental level. Back in the 17th century, every county had at least one militia regiment that was made up of the county, of the town units. As the colony and the county started to get bigger and towns started to split off, they divided it up into districts. So the Merrimack Valley region was the 4th Essex Regiment, which had towns from Andover to Salisbury. And it was commanded by Colonel Samuel Johnson Vandover. Newburyport, I believe, was part of the 3rd Essex, which again would have been pretty much from Newburyport starting heading down along the coastline towards Ipswich. Again, those county towns as part of it. So you had those regimental commanders that were taking place. Same when they formed the Minuteman companies. They voted a regimental commander that would represent the town units within their district. The overall commander at the time, in about March, early April of 1775, Massachusetts Provincial Congress got together and asked the exact question that you asked. Who's going to command all this when everything, who hits the van? Who's going to be the overall commander? Who's going to be his command staff? And so as a result, they chose Dr. Joseph Warren, who would be one of the commanders, and then Artemus Ward would be the other. Also in April of 1775, just about a week and a half before Lexington Concord, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress drafted articles of war outlining how to run, basically how to run and discipline an army during that time. So, sir.
Yeah, 2 questions. You referred to like a little pouch that holds the bullets or whatever. 18 or 19 of them?
18 to 20.
How did they run out? And how did they get more bullets? And my other question is that I had this perception that the British, when they were marching to Concord, were all lined up like ducks, and the colonists were off in the woods, hiding behind trees and stone walls. But you mentioned that light infantry or
Yep,
whatever?
light
And that sheet, I didn't know they had them. I thought they were just
So-
lined up.
I have not paid this gentleman to ask this awesome question. That's a question I love to talk about. So, the first thing was, yeah, they had about 18 to 19 rounds, and there was a supply problem as the war started. We're suddenly, for example, in the aftermath of the Battle of Bunker Hill, George Washington, when he took over from Artemus Ward to command the army, received a report where he basically said most of his troops only had 1 to 3 rounds of ammunition left. They didn't have anything. What normally happened is the towns were responsible for providing lead bullets and gunpowder to their men. So what they were doing, what I've seen in Lexington, for example, is a gentleman named Joshua Reed was going to various markets buying lead bricks. He was basically hunting lead bricks, trying to see if he could find them, and then bring them back and then melting it down to ammunition. When that didn't work, there's accounts of them basically getting a hold of the statutes in town, melting those down, taking lead off of, anything they could find to melt down to make ammunition. But if you ran out, you got a problem at that point. To get to your second point, that's an excellent thing. What basically happened was there was this perception that the British Army all fought in straight lines, marching in as they go along. To some extent that was true, but the purpose of light infantry was basically to match the warfare that they encountered during the French and Indian War here in North America, which meant fighting in the woods, fighting behind structures, individual firing shots, not these volley firing that they were having. Now, volley firing did happen, and the reason is because muskets are not accurate. They're smoothbore. The effective range is 100 yards, but the real true aim might be 50 to 75 yards at best. So light infantry's purpose was to screen and protect the main body and flush out the enemy as the main body would advance. So there are accounts during April 19th where there are troops marching in column, coming in, but you have light infantry out on the side protecting them. There's also accounts of British grenadiers who are also now starting to be trained in this similar type of warfare, when the light infantry, because they're becoming exhausted, are pulled in, and some of the grenadiers are going out to protect. So it's a new type of warfare for the British Army. They had just started formally adopting this about 3 years before Lexington and Concord. So these are new military tactics for them. But it was designed for warfare in North America. So, questions? No? Really, again, keep in mind, 5 feet, you can take that. All right.
People go home.
So my final thoughts, thank you so much. I'm going to have my reenactors come out very quickly. I will be back in June, I believe it is, for Battle of Bunker Hill. And the last thing is, here is my contact information. Sometimes I'm good at responding to my email, but if you want to follow me, I am doing in April what is called a real-time posting of the battles of Lexington and Concord, which means social media posts will go up the exact time they happened 250 years ago, and there will be Newburyport posts as part of that. So thank you very much, I really appreciate it.